Okay, the fallen of World War II was suggested by Neil Halloran. I hope I pronounced that correctly. This is the numbers of World War II, I believe. All right, I have not seen it. Well, I've seen the first couple minutes of it, so let's get into it.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years. And an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s, at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost.
I would say closer to 94 when this video is actually being made currently.
This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives are cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts.
So they are doing civilian and military. Clearly. Okay, that's important to note.
We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately.
Okay.
Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life. Whereas military deaths were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23. In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who were injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries. Yeah,
that's true. Casualty is anything that takes you off of the front line. Disease. The United States Civil War was known, the number one reason for casualties was disease. So not only killed, wounded, missing, and disease related, that's important.
Anything else that takes a soldier out of service. And here, we're just counting the deaths. And we'll begin with American soldiers. Over 400,000 died.
Yeah.
Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis.
Oh, wait a minute. Fighting the Germans. That should be important. That not everyone was a Nazi. It was like a third of the people in Germany, and I think that was at most, were actual Nazis. But when you're pressed into service, these are Germans, and also other fighters. So keep in mind.
And about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war. The war began on September 1st, 1939.
Some people do argue that it would be the war in the European campaign was started then. The war in the World War II, some people actually argue that it was a second battle of World War I, the Great War. The other one would be people who are more knowledgeable than I assume, also do say that the invasion of Manchuria was one of the tipping points for the beginning of World War II, and the other one would be the beginning of the Sino-Japanese War, and that was 1937. So as soon as the Chinese and Japanese fought, that would be considered the beginning for some.
But the U.S. wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in.
I guess it depends what your perspective is.
The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy. One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans fell. So about the same number of U.S. soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan.
Okay.
The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died. About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks.
I did not know that. I didn't know 5,000 were from kamikazes. I for some reason, I did not think they were that effective during the battle, but apparently they were. Learn something new every day.
Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe.
Okay.
Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland. Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war. Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union.
You know what? This is important to note. Poland really embodies the European theater of World War II. And I mean because it was started with Poland and Germany. After that, Polish troops went to Britain, went to France. I believe during the 1940 invasion of France, there were 2 Polish divisions, I want to say, that fought with the Allies. And then there was an RAF unit. There was a Polish parachute brigade. There was another Polish division that fought in Italy. I want to say North Africa as well, and also fought with the Soviets. And then, I mean, the civilian toll, which I'm sure you can see right here. Okay. I'm thinking it was 1.5 million plus. I don't know if they know what the exact numbers were of civilians that were killed.
Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland. The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France. Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths. The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both.
It's important to note about Yugoslavia that they had an extremely successful guerrilla operation, I guess you'd call it, partisan operations. The invasion, yes, was extremely swift, and that was that. But Tito and his partisans, they created havoc, tied down a lot of German troops, and it was, they were a thing. And it also caused some repercussions because of it amongst the Yugoslavian population. But and they were supported by the Allies, too, to a certain extent.
Both sides.
British namely.
But the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions. The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success. And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the U.S., which includes the British colonies.
I did not know that. I didn't know that. I mean, you think you have all the numbers in your head, but I had no clue that the United Kingdom lost the same number as the United States. I just assumed they lost more. I guess I'm thinking because of World War I. But they didn't have all of India either. That was in the, but that would have still been, India did have mass famine. I don't think that was necessarily related. It probably was, and to a certain extent related to the war, but India was going through a great famine as well. So they didn't have all their colonies to draw upon. World War I kind of saw the end to the colonies. The United States really didn't care, or at least Roosevelt did not care, that the United Kingdom didn't have as much access to their colonies and their resources as they did before the war.
Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the U.S. and Britain in what is known as the Western Front.
Now that's important. they say that the defense is usually you need like 3 attacking soldiers for 1 defending soldier. But the Germans, towards the end of the war, the soldier experiences were much less, attrition, all sorts of stuff. They lost manpower to, but they did do a very good job at the defense on the Western Front. Western Europe and Italy also was a fantastic area of German defense. Kesselring did a wonderful job. Smiling Albert, they called him. So they put up a good defense. And against the Soviets as well, it must be noted.
Which took place in France and Belgium. But most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front.
Yeah.
Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union. The numbers are staggering. The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return.
Can you believe that? 500,000 prisoners and only 6,000 returned.
POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US. And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany.
Yeah. These numbers are crazy.
The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers.
German soldiers.
But winning the war came at a cost.
This is a whole generation that's gone, wiped out, and it has repercussions to this day. Jeez, look at it go. And that's not even mentioning Stalin's purges.
$8.7 million is the official tally by the Russian military, a hotly disputed number.
Yeah, I bet.
Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million dead.
Wow, that is a skew.
To complete the count of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa.
Oh, I guess we didn't.
As well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis, Hungary, Romania, and Italy. When you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this. You can now interact with the chart to learn more. Pause the narration if you would like more time.
That's crazy. I'm going to go to the website. Not now, but...
And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe.
Oh, God. And we haven't even gotten into the Asian Pacific
6
theater.
million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust.
Oh, the Holocaust, yes.
If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets, followed by Hungary and 17 other countries. Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were killed in the concentration camps. Over 1 million died in Auschwitz. Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution. The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train station. Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews.
Mobile killing groups, that's important to note. On the heels of the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans were followed up by these death squads, and they massacred people. First of all, they massacred almost anybody. I would say there was no real oversight. But if you were Jewish, especially, that was you were a huge target. It was the idea of it was called living space. I can't remember the German words, like Lebensraum or something like that. And the idea was exterminate and move everybody out of Eastern Europe and allow for more living space for the Germans. It was this idea that they were going to expand their living space. It was, and these killing squads did that.
Like with the gas chambers, men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt.
Yeah. It's a good video.
The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called Gypsies, were killed. The numbers are disputed.
Yeah, I thought that was in there too. Okay.
About 250,000 people with disabilities were killed.
Yeah.
Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers were relatively small. Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation.
2 million.
Some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz.
Okay.
When you combine civilian and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II, which is the highest percentage of any country. But not the highest in total death count.
Right.
The Soviet Union again tops that list, losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million. A particularly dark moment for the Soviet Union was the siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg.
Yeah.
German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies including
German forces and Finnish forces. Finnish
food were cut off for 2.5 years. 1.5 million people died as a result, mostly from starvation, mostly civilians. Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers. He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities, thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag. Just about every country suffered civilian losses.
It's interesting to note that a lot of people died in labor camps in the Soviet Union. When you're talking about manpower, I mean, the Germans, I mean, they were exterminating the Jews. I mean, you're taking your own manpower to a certain extent if you want to be black and white about it or blunt about it. Then the Soviets, they were all in. There was a purge, and then after the purge, in the military, and not just the military, actually, all of the Soviet Union, then they were invaded after the purge. And they also, anyone who committed crimes, deserters, I mean, anyone they can get their hands on, basically, that wasn't fighting during the war, were sent to the Gulag or these labor camps, and most died there.
Especially countries who were invaded. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident. Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food. The intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States.
That is true. Nobody wants to talk about, I don't want to say nobody, but it is still very taboo to talk about civilian casualties that were done just for whatever reason, whether they were targeted because of a bombing campaign or an angry soldier, an angry group, for whatever particular reason. And Also, even on their own officers. War is hell, it was said by William Tecumseh Sherman, I think. But you got a whole bunch of men, generally, men, in one place for the first time, and atrocities are going to be committed, especially when there isn't a lot of oversight and they're given weapons. You have to think about that, and not to mention young men of a certain age. The amount of rapes that happened, the ones that were reported are one thing, but the ones that were not reported are another. And by the way, don't think that just because it was considered a good war doesn't mean that it didn't happen on both sides. It happened on both sides.
The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers. The UK did the same to German cities at a much greater magnitude, causing about 10 times the number of deaths.
It's important to note that the British doctrine, the Royal Air Force, the backbone was the bombers. And so the Germans were more, fighter bombers, close support aircraft at the beginning of the war. At the beginning of the war, the British had already decided that their air power was going to be surrounded by the core, which was the bombers. And they were quite effective. And on top of that, even at night, they were very effective. And, then with the help of once the Americans got on board with the production numbers, it was just through the roof.
But most German civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war. When the Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million.
Once it became known that, it was more general knowledge that the Soviets were not going to take prisoners, because the Germans were horrible. They didn't really take many Soviet prisoners. I mean, the ones that they did take, which were still a lot, they did not treat them well. There were many accounts of Americans receiving packages from the Red Cross and things like that. Not the Soviet soldiers. They were not treated well at all. And when it came to the end of the war, the German soldiers knew it. Sort of an open secret, even if you're in the front, I guess. And they tried to surrender to the West like crazy. I think it was the German 9th Army, I want to say, that was south of Berlin after or during the encirclement of Berlin. They were encircled by Soviet soldiers. They fought through they were on the Eastern Front, surrounded by Soviet soldiers, like armies. And they fought westward to get to the Allied lines. And everyone kind of knew that they wanted to surrender to the Allies for the better treatment. Although there were certain exceptions, it was still much better than what the Soviets were going to do. But the soldiers died just to get to the correct side, I guess, the better side to surrender. And that's important to note about the Soviets versus the Germans.
Let's step back and see where we are with the totals. We just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe.
Yeah.
If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million. Then we have the Asian theater.
Oh, all right.
Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan.
Yeah.
On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the cruelty.
Yeah, this was even part of the Japanese doctrine. I mean, once they took over an area, I want to say it was like Nanking, which was the capital at the time, the Nanking Massacre. It was about 300 some thousand. I think it was Pearl Buck wrote a book about this. It's called the Nanking Massacre, and they would just do unspeakable things, behead people in line. After the fighting, after the fighting, they took the city. They went to town, killing the civilian population. It was terrible, and it's because Germany surrendered first, and Japan surrendered second. A lot of people went unpunished, and I want to say to this day, Japan has not apologized for the war crimes, but they could care less about the civilian population, the Chinese civilian population. They were seen as, I don't know, blood sport, whatever you want to call it.
China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people. Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance. 500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed.
That's right.
Which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis.
Oh, I forgot about that.
But the invasion of China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers. Most were killed fighting the U.S. and allies in the Pacific War.
Oh, I didn't know that.
A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks. Contrary to official U.S. statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations, not military targets.
Yeah, the U.S. With the fire bombings. Oh, gosh, I can't remember. The general. Maybe you guys could tell me in the comments. The general that basically firebombed Tokyo. Basically took out, I think it was like 2/3 of the city in a number of fire bombings.
When you add all the deaths outside of Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war.
Yeah.
Give or take, depending on who's counting, and what civilian deaths get included. More people died in World War II than in any other war in history. For comparison, here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record.
Look at that. There's Stalin at 20 million, Mao at 40 million. World War I had only 15 million. I don't want to say only, but I always thought World War I was higher than that, but those are military deaths. There was not, there was a significant civilian population that died, but that was basically in one particular area for World War I. Russian Civil War, 9 million. Chinese Civil War, 3. Okay. British India, 17 million. Fall of the Ming Dynasty, yeah. American Indians, 20 million. I want to say that number is wrong, only on the aspect of that I don't think disease is on there. But anyway, that's an interesting...
Some of these are more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry.
Yeah, okay, I see.
Some of these spanned across centuries. World War II had the highest body count, and it all happened in just 6 years.
Yeah, 6 years, wow, okay.
The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list.
But there are repercussions. The Soviet Union hasn't recovered. You can argue that a whole generation's gone. A whole generation's gone in Germany. A whole generation's gone in France and Britain. Not so much in the United States, though, because our infrastructure was not. Oh, and Japan. That's also, and China. When it came to the United States, we were relatively untouched here in the United States. Our infrastructure was complete. Our manufacturing was complete. And let's just call it what it is. The British holding on was one thing, but the Soviets took the brunt of the of the war. A lot of us talk about World War II in the context of, what the Americans did, what the British did, the Allied effort, and then they also say, and then there was the Russian effort. Yeah, well, the Russian effort was huge. Without them, who knows what? That's revisionist history. I'm not getting into that. Or, the what if history. I'm not getting into that. That's for other people to do. But Soviet Union, I hate to say, carried the war. I don't hate to say it. It's just the way it is. They did carry the war. There, I said it.
If you want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died, we can adjust the chart to look like this. This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking.
Yeah, nowadays we focus on war crimes, things like that. We didn't used to do that. I mean, can you see us today talking about the Armenian genocide during and after World War One? Not much. People were not held accountable really until World War II. And if you look at the Ukrainian war now, that's another thing. So casualties are changing. But if the Ukraine, and I'm not an alarmist, I'm just throwing this out there, if the Ukraine becomes a stepping stone for a larger war and we have a World War III kind of thing, well, you've got two choices. It's either going to be nuclear or it's going to be completely devastating to civilians. And then war crimes, good luck holding people accountable. I mean, yeah.
When we turn to post-war conflicts, it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial. But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening.
The peace.
In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase the long peace to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used, although its meaning may have shifted. European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary.
Take note that this has just changed. The Ukrainian war. This is March 25th, 2023 when I'm recording this. Ukraine war is going on. And right now we're talking about a stalemate. Are the Ukrainians going to have a second offensive? That's exactly where we are right now with that war. It's another European war. It's the worst European war since World War II. So there you go. And look at everybody rearming right now, especially Poland. If you watch this video this far, you might know why Poland is rearming and why Germany is a little hesitant to rearm. History is important.
When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale. And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II. Rich countries have fought poorer countries, like the US versus Iraq. But rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire. To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War II, and they can be grouped into these four categories. We don't see colonial wars anymore. We've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all. And here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off. That leaves civil wars of two types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since.
I'm thinking right about here in Ukraine is where it's going to be. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Because this is now outdated.
And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II.
Yeah, with peace comes population growth. Not as much in the they don't like people saying former Soviet, but in Eastern Europe not so much, but definitely in Western Europe and the Americas.
We scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle. The downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day.
Mm-hmm.
You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now bear in mind we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths, but those too are in decline. Peace is a difficult thing to measure. It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened.
Ooh, that's interesting.
We give such importance to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us. Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does.
Interesting.
But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
Is that it? Yeah, there it is. Neil, good job on that. Wow. Unfortunately, it's becoming a little outdated. I would love to see an updated one. I really would. If that doesn't put the numbers of World War II in perspective, I don't know what does. That's fascinating. I would love to hear your comments down below, guys. Again, thank you for following. If you like what you see here, like I said, leave a comment, hit the like button, subscribe if you're into this stuff. And hey, if you could share it out, that'd be great. Wonderful stuff. Thank you. Let me know, by the way, if there's another video that you want me to do a reaction to. These are fascinating. I love it. Thanks, guys.